married my husband, I wasn't under the illusion that blending into his life would be effortless. He had 3 adult children from his previous marriage, all of them in their mid-20s when we first got serious. I knew they'd always have a close bond with their mother, and I respected that. What I didn't expect was the ice wall they would build around themselves and how determined they were to keep me on the outside of it. The first year I really tried. I'd ask them out for lunch, text them during holidays, buy thoughtful gifts that showed I paid attention to their likes. I never asked them to call me anything other than my name. I didn't force a connection or try to replace their mom. All I wanted was something resembling mutual respect. Instead, I got the cold shoulder and half-hearted thank yous, if any, at all. At family gatherings, they'd greet everyone warmly, then nod in my direction like I was the neighbor's cousin who happened to be in the room. When I hosted a Christmas dinner one year, they barely made conversation. I remember one moment where I passed a dish across the table to the eldest, and she reached for it without so much as looking at me. My husband noticed. He always noticed. However, he found himself in an impossible position, wanting peace, yet unsure of how to confront his children without making things worse. Once I pulled him aside and told him that I was okay with their distance as long as they weren't outright cruel. He said that he hoped in time they'd soften. They knew I was kind. They knew I cared about him. He thought they'd come around. They never did. Year 2, then year 3, we were approaching 5 years together and nothing had changed. I stopped trying so hard. Not out of spite, just out of exhaustion. They weren't interested in knowing me, so I stopped pushing my way into their lives. We settled into this unspoken agreement. I didn't reach out, and they didn't bother pretending to be polite. They never invited me to any of their events. I heard about one of them graduating through my husband. Another got a promotion and shared it with the rest of the family, my husband included, but left me off the group message entirely. I didn't even know they had a baby until my husband casually mentioned it over dinner, like it was common knowledge. When I asked why he didn't tell me sooner, he just looked tired and said he figured I wouldn't be invited to the christening anyway. I didn't cry. I wasn't angry. I was just done. I told him that I was finished setting a table for people who never intended to sit with me. He said that he understood. I believed him. He stopped pushing the narrative that things would magically improve. I stopped pretending they ever respected me. Now what's important to know is that my husband and I live a very comfortable life. We've worked hard and we've been smart with our investments, but he comes from more modest means. His income, while solid, isn't nearly on par with mine, and he's always been open about that. His kids, however, seem to think that marrying me somehow elevated their future fortunes too. They never asked outright, but it was there, the offhand jokes, the assumptions, the way they spoke about vacations and future inheritances like they were guaranteed to reap the benefits of our lifestyle. I found it strange at first, but shrugged it off. Maybe they were just being casual. Then I overheard something at a barbecue that stuck with me. One of them said that they were glad their dad had finally done well for himself, and that at least it'll pay off for us later. I remember blinking for a few seconds, unsure if I'd even heard them correctly. Pay off? For who? I hadn't even known they were nearby. They weren't speaking to me. They were speaking about me. After that, things started making more sense. Their distant behavior, paired with entitled undertones, it wasn't personal, not really. It was strategic. I was useful, not important. I was someone whose presence they tolerated because it benefited them on paper, and they didn't even bother hiding it anymore. By the time we reached our 7th year of marriage, I had long since decided how I wanted to handle my estate. I was the product of a hard-working family and years of building wealth through careful investments, real estate, and smart financial decisions. I never had children of my own. I knew that when I passed, I wanted my money to go to causes that meant something to me: education, women's shelters, and environmental projects. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't emotional. It was just logic. You don't leave your legacy to people who made it very clear you weren't welcome in theirs. My husband supported the decision without hesitation. He said that it was my money, my choice. He was proud of the life I'd built. He also updated his own estate plan. Everything he had would go to his children as expected, but we kept our finances separate for a reason, and this was one of them. We didn't tell the kids. He didn't want to, and I thought it was none of their business. That revelation would come later. But for now, I lived in the peace of knowing that I no longer owe these people anything. Not my time, not my attention, and certainly not my money. Update 1. The blowback started almost immediately after the lawyer finalized the estate paperwork. It wasn't a dramatic reading of a will or anything theatrical like in the movies. It was just a quiet update, standard procedure. My husband and I were both present. We signed everything with calm professionalism. My portion of the estate was going to charity, just like I had always intended. The news must have gotten back to the kids within a week. And suddenly the phones were ringing. My husband must have informed them. My husband's eldest daughter called first. She hadn't spoken to me directly in over 3 years. I still had her number saved out of habit, though it had been collecting dust in my contacts list. So when I saw her name flash on my screen, I stared at it for a second longer than necessary before handing it to my husband without a word. She had clearly expected me to pick up, because the voicemail she left was a passive-aggressive monologue masked in politeness. She said she'd heard some things, and if it was true, she was just disappointed that I didn't even consider family before making such a huge decision. She said that while she knew we'd had our differences, she assumed I would have the decency to include them in the conversation since they were, her words not mine, technically my stepchildren. I didn't even bother replying. A day later, the younger one sent a message through my husband. Didn't even contact me directly. He read it out loud at the dinner table with a grimace. Apparently she felt blindsided and accused me of hoarding resources that could have gone towards securing the family future. My husband raised an eyebrow at that and said he wasn't sure what future she was talking about, since she'd made it painfully clear I wasn't part of her present. He didn't say it to be cruel, just honest. Then came the family group chat, which I had left a long time ago because I was tired of being ignored or looped in only when they wanted something from me. They added me again. News started circulating, and mutual relatives were now asking my husband whether it was true that I was leaving everything to strangers. One aunt even asked whether I'd lost my mind and why I'd punished the kids for childish attitudes. Someone else chimed in saying I should forgive and forget because life is short and family is everything. One of them already has a child. Why would she have a child if she still had a childish attitude? It's wild how everyone suddenly remembers your family when there's money involved. Before that, I was barely acknowledged. I was the woman who tagged along to holiday parties, the one who they assumed would sit at the end of the table or offer to do the dishes. I was never included in birthday plans, never consulted about family decisions, never invited to important life moments. I was invisible until I became inconvenient. Now they were calling me inconsiderate. Ironic, considering they never once considered me. One night, after another flurry of messages, my husband sat beside me and asked if I wanted him to step in. He was trying to keep the peace as usual. I told him he didn't owe them damage control for the choices they made. He had always been in the middle, and I respected the way he handled it, with patience, with grace. But I didn't need him to explain or justify what I had done. And she looked like she'd practiced her speech in the car mirror a few times before knocking. My husband opened the door and was clearly surprised, but he let her in. I stayed seated. I wasn't going to be cornered or guilt-tripped into a conversation I didn't owe anyone. She asked if we could talk. I asked if this was about money. She looked offended. She said it wasn't just about that. She said that while she didn't agree with how distant we'd become, she still thought of me as someone who's been there. I reminded her that she had over 5 years to say something like that before this moment, and never once did. She started listing reasons: growing up, feeling loyalty to her mom, feeling like I tried to step into a role that wasn't mine. She said it all like it excused the way she treated me, like a placeholder for more than the last half decade, like it explained away the fact that she didn't even speak to me unless it was through her father. Then she said it, the sentence that made it all click. She said that maybe since I didn't have kids of my own, I couldn't understand how hard it was to let someone else in. I tilted my head and told her that maybe, since she never tried, she wouldn't understand what it was like to be left out. There was a long pause. She didn't say much after that. Before she left, she asked if I would reconsider. I said no. She didn't slam the door, didn't cry, didn't yell, just left. I don't know what she thought she'd get out of that conversation, but I think she expected me to break down, to apologize, to admit I'd been too harsh. But I didn't feel harsh. I felt measured, firm. Later, my husband sat beside me on the couch and said she'd asked him the same thing. He told her that the decision wasn't up for discussion and that I wasn't being cold. I was being fair. I had spent years trying to be a part of their family. They spent all of it making sure I knew I wasn't. And now that money was on the table, they wanted to redraw the lines? No. You don't get to demand someone's legacy when you refuse to make room for them in your life. You don't get to say, we're family, after years of treating someone like a stranger. And you certainly don't get to call someone inconsiderate when your only consideration for them comes at the cost of your inheritance. Update 2. If anything, I thought things might die down after that awkward visit from his daughter, but instead, it kicked up a whole new storm. A few days later, I received a carefully worded message from a relative on his side. Not someone I was ever close to, mind you, just someone who had always floated quietly in the background during weddings, funerals, and group photos. They suddenly had a lot to say now that the words charity and will had entered the conversation. She wrote that while she didn't mean to interfere, she hoped I'd reevaluate my decision, that money like that could change lives, and wouldn't I rather help people I knew than complete strangers. She even closed the email by saying she hoped I wasn't doing this out of bitterness, because if so, then I was only punishing myself in the long run. Punishing myself? That was rich coming from someone who didn't even know what year I got married. But the truth was, the bitterness wasn't mine. That seed was planted years ago by people who refused to offer a single shred of goodwill or connection between us, yet now somehow felt entitled to the harvest. They'd boxed me out of every family moment, treated me like I was permanently on probation, and now they were stunned that I wasn't passing out golden tickets just because the estate was bigger than they'd imagined. None of them knew what I had built, how much time, sweat, and stability I had contributed over the years. I didn't marry into wealth, I created it. Yes, I was well off, which gave me a good start. I'd spent most of my life being smart about investments, patient with long-term growth, careful about spending. My late parents taught me that if I ever had enough to help someone, make sure it went somewhere it mattered. So no, I wasn't doing this out of spite. I was doing this with intention. I had chosen a charity that supported underfunded rural schools in memory of a friend of mine who never got to finish her education because she had to work from the age of 15. I chose to fund a women's shelter in the same city I grew up in because I remembered what it felt like to live paycheck to paycheck when I wanted to be independent. That money was going where it mattered, not to entitled grown adults who thought they deserved something just because their father married me. But that didn't stop them from trying. The next thing I knew, the middle child, his son, sent over a proposal. That's literally what he called it. My husband read it out loud, and I swear it felt like we were in some ridiculous boardroom meeting. The email was drafted like a pitch. He laid out suggestions for how the money could be better allocated, including a down payment for his dream home, some help with his student loans, and a buffer fund for what he called future entrepreneurial endeavors. No shame, none. He ended it by saying he understood that we hadn't had the best relationship, but felt that this gesture could rebuild trust. Imagine that. After ignoring me for years, mocking my presence during family dinners, excluding me from every group plan, and referring to me as Dad's new wife to anyone who asked, he now wanted trust, bought and paid for. I didn't even respond. I let my lawyer do the talking that time. She drafted a short professional reply. The estate decisions were final, legal, and not up for negotiation. She used all the correct language, but between the lines, the message was clear. Stop begging. It didn't sit well with them, obviously. I knew that because they started getting bold. I saw Facebook posts about greedy people with no kids and how sad it is when people forget where they come from. I got tagged in one of those vague families should stick together posts by a cousin-in-law I'd never even met in person. Then came the pity parade from their side of the family. People trying to frame me as cold-hearted for choosing outsiders over blood. But here's the thing. Blood doesn't make someone family. Decency does. So does kindness, effort, consistency. And none of those were ever offered to me. Not when I tried, not when I waited, not when I extended grace time and again. I had sat through dinners where I was spoken over, holidays where I was ignored, and group trips I wasn't even invited to. My presence had always been tolerated at best, resented at worst. Now they wanted inheritance-level access after giving me hand-me-down scraps of respect. My husband, to his credit, stood beside me through all of it. He never once asked me to reconsider. He didn't try to convince me to split things differently. In fact, he told me one night that he was proud of the way I'd handled everything. He said that while he had always hoped things would mend between me and his kids, he couldn't deny that they had made their bed and it wasn't my job to fluff the pillows. He even called a family meeting. I wasn't there by choice. He asked if I wanted to be, but I said no. I didn't need to watch them fake civility. I didn't want to see the looks of shock when they realized my husband wasn't going to be their loophole. I'd seen enough of those expressions to last a lifetime. He came home quiet that night, but not defeated. He told me that the message had landed. They didn't like it, but they heard it. Some tried to argue, some walked out. One tried to guilt him by saying I was trying to erase their family's legacy, but he didn't budge. He told them that if they had treated me like family when it mattered, they wouldn't be learning this lesson the hard way. So yeah, I was the villain now in their eyes. But only because I stopped giving to people who never gave back. They didn't want me, just what I had. And I was okay with giving them nothing at all. Update 3. It was barely a week after the family meeting when I got the message. Not from any of the kids, not even through my husband. It came straight from their mother. Her name popped up in my inbox like a bad penny, with a subject line that read, "We need to talk, woman to woman." I didn't owe her anything, but I opened it. She started with pleasantries, which was a surprise. She said she hoped I was doing well, that she had always respected me from afar, even if we hadn't spoken much. She called our current situation unfortunate and blown out of proportion, and then almost casually slipped in a line about how she hoped I'd reconsider my estate plans for the sake of the children's future. For the children's future. The same children who had spent years treating me like I was an intrusive stain on their father's life. I closed the email and let it sit for a few days. I wasn't going to reply in anger, and I definitely wasn't going to play into her narrative of gracious peacemaker. But the longer I sat with it, the clearer it became that I needed to address it head on, not for her sake, but for mine. So I wrote back. I told her I appreciated the tone of her message, but I wasn't confused about its purpose. She wasn't reaching out for closure. She was trying to reopen doors her children had spent years slamming in my face. I reminded her that I hadn't blown anything out of proportion. I had simply stopped trying. I'd shown up time and again with open arms, and her children had never once made room for me in their lives. They hadn't just been cold, they'd been deliberately cruel. I wasn't looking for friendship, only basic respect. I never got it. Then I got to the part she probably didn't expect. I told her that while she was asking me to consider her children's future, no one had once asked what role they played in shaping mine. They'd made my holidays uncomfortable. They'd made my marriage harder. They'd made it crystal clear they saw me as disposable. And now that money was involved, suddenly I was supposed to become the doting stepmother they never wanted. No, that ship sailed when they laughed at my birthday card and left it unopened on the table. When they showed up late to the dinner I spent 3 days prepping and cooking. When they threw a surprise party for their father's birthday and never sent me an invite. Every moment of silence, every snide comment, every act of dismissal, those were their choices. This outcome was mine. I ended the message by saying that I wasn't angry, but I was over it, and that just because I didn't throw tantrums, raise my voice, didn't mean I lacked backbone. Grace didn't mean passivity. I wished her well, but there would be no further discussion. I didn't hear from her after that, but of course silence doesn't mean surrender, because a few days later my husband received a message from his eldest daughter saying their mom was really upset and that everything could have gone differently if I hadn't been so difficult. Difficult. That's the word they chose. Not tired, not hurt, not disappointed. Difficult. And that was when it hit me. They weren't actually angry that I was giving my money to charity. They were angry because they were snobbish and entitled. They had always assumed that proximity to me meant access, that I would cave if they just played their cards right. And when the game didn't go their way, they pulled in their mother like she was some kind of moral trump card. But I didn't flinch. I didn't backtrack, and I sure as hell didn't offer explanations to people who never earned the right to ask for one. Instead, I hosted a brunch. Not for them, God no. For the people who had actually shown up over the years. Friends, cousins on my side, co-workers who had become chosen family. I raised a glass to future plans and announced publicly that I was creating a trust in my parents' name, with all of it going to the two causes closest to my heart. I didn't hide it. I didn't sugarcoat it. And when word got back to the kids that I'd made it public, oh, hell broke loose. This time it wasn't the polite messages or cryptic posts, it was direct. One of them called me drunk, I think, and told me I was twisting the knife and making this personal. I didn't even argue. I just asked as calmly as I could whether they'd ever once invited me to a family vacation, whether they'd ever texted me happy birthday, whether they'd ever thanked me for a single thing I did for their father or how I helped him recover after his surgery last year, or how I gave up 3 years of my own career momentum to support him while he launched his new business. The silence on the other end said everything. I told them I wasn't making this personal. They had done that part themselves. What I was doing finally was making it intentional. Update 4. The fallout wasn't immediate, but it came like a slow building storm. At first, my husband was quiet. Not withdrawn exactly, but processing. He's the kind of man who doesn't react in the moment. He absorbs, he listens, he lets things settle before he speaks. I used to admire that, still do, especially now. It took him about a week before he said anything about the message his ex had sent me, or the drunken call from his daughter that I had relayed to him word for word, without adding a single ounce of emotion. I didn't want to influence him, I just wanted him to know. When he finally did speak, it was over breakfast. He was staring into his coffee, half listening to the news on TV, and then he said, almost absently, that he was embarrassed. Not by them, though that was implied, but by himself. That he'd let it get this far. That he had sat by for years thinking they'd eventually warm up to me. That maturity or life experience would humble them. He thought time would fix what their hearts refused to. But it hadn't. Instead, time had made them worse. More convinced that they owed something, more delusional about what their father's money meant for their future. He asked me if I still had the message from their mother. I nodded. He asked me to forward it to him, and I did. By noon, he was on the phone with his lawyer. At first, I didn't know what he was doing. He didn't say much. Just that he wanted to clean some things up, legally. It wasn't until dinner that he told me, without any build-up, that he was amending his will. He said he'd had them listed in it for years, even after their behavior had started to sour. Even made it official again through our lawyers. He'd held on to hope, clinging to the idea that blood would somehow outweigh resentment. But after everything, after watching how they treated me, how quickly they turned on him when their expectations weren't met, he was done. He said it out loud. They weren't just entitled, they were ungrateful, mean-spirited, and manipulative. And he wasn't going to reward that. He told me he was splitting his estate in half now, one portion going directly to the charitable foundation I was setting up in support of causes we both believed in. The rest would go to people who actually cared. That meant a few of his cousins, an old friend who had helped him get through a rough patch after his divorce, and yes, me. Not because I demanded it, not because I asked, but because I stayed. I didn't interrupt, I just listened, and I saw, for the first time in years, a kind of clarity on his face that had long been missing whenever it came to his children. But clarity comes with consequences, because the moment the amendments were made and words somehow leaked back to them, God knows how, probably his ex again, things exploded. I think he had a conversation with her. It started with a group message to him, one long, raging monologue from his youngest, accusing him of being manipulated, saying that he was letting some gold digger, that would be me apparently, erase the bloodline. It's not like he was honor killing them. He replied once, simply asking her to never refer to me like that again. Then came the eldest daughter. Her message was short but brutal. She accused her father of abandoning the family, of siding with someone who never truly fit in, and of allowing bitterness to cloud judgment. She said she couldn't believe her father would turn on them over something as petty as a disagreement over a will. Petty. They were calling his line in the sand petty. It wasn't just projection, it was audacity, raw, unchecked audacity. Then came the call from his ex-wife. That one he took on speakerphone. She started soft, always her strategy. She said she was confused. She said she thought he loved their children. She asked how he could do something so permanent without even talking to them first. He stayed silent for a moment and then asked her why she thought he hadn't spoken to them. Because every conversation with them ended the same way, with accusations, with defensiveness, with an underlying assumption that he would always come around in the end. She tried to steer it back towards sympathy, talked about how they were just upset, that they didn't mean it, and this was all about family and legacy, and maybe emotions had gotten the best of everyone. But he didn't let her finish. He told her he wasn't interested in parenting adults who refused to take accountability, that their choices had led them here, and that this wasn't revenge, it was a correction. He told her he loved his children, always would, but he no longer recognized who they'd become, and he wouldn't enable it anymore, not with money, not with silence. And then he ended the call. He turned to me afterwards, visibly drained, and said he wished he'd done this years ago. I didn't gloat, I didn't say I told you so. I just placed a hand on his shoulder and told him it wasn't too late to protect his peace. That maybe now he finally had a chance to live out the rest of his life, not waiting for people to change, but choosing to be around those who already had. We slept better that night than we had in months. He said that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is stop making excuses for people who don't love you back. Stay tuned for more stories from our girl relationships.